So I'm going to do a PowerPoint as well, and this is the first time I've ever done it to PowerPoint, thanks to my wife who's been helping, and she's the technical boss next to me. Moshe Dayan, and for any of you who've either seen or heard the earlier podcasts, know that I have a certain way of presenting material. I like to start off with a bit about bibliography, and then I go through pretty chronologically the lives of the people. Just want to make one comment. As you know, I was in Orange County in Irvine for a month in January. It was one of the best experiences of my life. It was just wonderful. Since I came back, I've been speaking about it. People are fascinated by it. So the opportunity for me now to get back to Orange County, although I'm far away in Israel, is wonderful. So thank you all for coming to listen to me again. So just a little bit about the basic bibliography. My wife is we're just trying to get into this. It's just one up. If you can just, sorry, we're just still getting, oopsies.
Oops.
We're still having some technical problems. Okay, so you can see this is the basic bibliography. Dayan wrote 4 books, 3 of which are well known. The 4th one is not well known. The first one is his diary. He wrote it 9 years after the event. And he made some quite big mistakes. I'll be talking about that. His main book is The Story of My Life. It took a year and a half to write. Very interesting. Very, very egocentrical. Dayan, as you'll see, is all about himself, which is maybe what many politicians are. The most interesting one in some ways is living with the Bible. It's unexpected. Here's a military man who later became a politician, who wrote a very personal story about how he relates to the Bible. And it really does express his Zionism in a powerful way. The 4th one, as I mentioned, is not well known. It's about the Egypt-Israel peace negotiations. If any of you are really interested in reading a good biography, not an autobiography, I would recommend the one by Mordechai Baron, Moshe Dayan, Israel's Controversial Hero. The reason is Mordechai was Dayan's assistant at various stages in the army, knows him very, very well, and he wrote a critical, analytical biography, so I think it's good for everyone to read if you're interested in going into it in more detail. So Moshe Dayan was born in Kibbutz Degania in 1915. The Dayan family is royalty in Israel, as close as you can get to royalty. They're kind of the Kennedys of Israel. And there are a number of issues which put them into that very central position. Firstly, being on Kibbutz Degania, which was the first kibbutz. In 1909 it was built. Moshe Dayan was born in 1915, and it's kind of one of those places, one of those moments in Israeli history where you say, I was born in Degania. You know, it says just about everything. So the Dayan family belonged to that particular environment. Let's think a little bit about his family. But here's Moshe Dayan with his parents. And here we're going to go into some pretty tough components about Dayan's life. On the left is his father, and on the right is his mother, Dvorah. Just let me say something about what he wrote about in terms of his mother, Dvorah. She failed to integrate into the life of the small group on Degania. She could not speak Hebrew or Yiddish. The others thought her bourgeois in dress and values and had no interest in her Russian culture she loved. When she applied for membership in the kibbutz, she was turned down after a long discussion on the ground that she did not fit into the group. So she had to go off to another place, Sedgera, which was another collective area. And only after she had learned a bit of Hebrew and sort of really become much more Israeli, was she going to be accepted. But the Dayan family really never could be kibbutznikim. It was too collective for them. And therefore what they did was move on to Nahalal, Moshav Nahalal, where they met in 1921. Dates in Israel are very important. Moshav Nahalal was the first Moshav, which has some collective components, but not all. And they moved there in 1921 at the very beginning of Moshav Nahalal. By the way, in terms of structure, Moshav Nahalal has a particular reputation on being like a bicycle's spokes. And the idea was, whereas on kibbutz, people would often live far away from the dining room and from the secretary's office or whatever it is, in the case of Nahalal, built by one of Israel's well-known architects, this idea of allowing everyone to be fairly close to the center is what it's all about. Nahalal, by the way, has a major reputation in Israel until today. Looking at the family, we look here at Ruth and Moshe, married 1935 to 1971. Here we come to a very, very tough part about the Dayan family, and that is, to just put it on the table, Moshe was a total womanizer. From a young age, pretty much as he got into his 60s, up to the 60s, he constantly was involved with other women. Now, Ruth Dayan, as she was when she married, came from a very elitist family that had spent time in England. And I have a feeling that Ruth's parents weren't particularly impressed with Moshe Dayan, who was a rough kind of fellow, even from a young age. And that marriage was very, very unsuccessful. Many people have asked why she stayed with him for such a long time. And it's unknown. I think in those days, actually, people stayed married, although they weren't in any sense particularly loyal to each other. In terms of the family, here we have the three children. And if Moshe had problems with his wife, or she had problems with him, the children are also very complex, a very complex family. Between Ruth and Moshe, we have Assi. Assi Dayan is known in Israel as a major filmmaker. He was involved in about 50 movies and television series. However, on the other hand, he became a drug addict and very violent, and was therefore, they managed to keep him out of jail, but he had to do community service. And Assi Dayan was really a very tough case study. Udi, or Ehud, who's between Moshe and the daughter Yael, Ehud had such a bad relationship with his father that when Moshe Dayan died, Udi wasn't in the will, wasn't in the family will. And he wrote a book about his relationship with his father, which is very, very critical. Moshe's relationship with Yael, the daughter, were much better. And she also, by the way, very, very talented person. She wrote a number of novels and 3 historically based books. One of the books that she wrote was about her father. And in her book on the father, she has a very divided view of him. She says he was very capable, he had initiative, he was a go-ahead kind of person. On the other hand, she, like the rest of the family, was very, very critical of his sort of family relationships. Moshe Dayan is a military person, and the fact that he moved into politics at a later stage was quite unusual. At that time, there were 4 underground groups, underground Jewish militias. The best known is probably the Haganah, but the interesting story about Moshe Dayan in the Haganah was that he was arrested by the British in 1939 because they had illegal arms activities. And he was put into jail, and originally there was a show trial. And the people who were arrested, some 30 people who were arrested from the Haganah, were given a 10-year prison sentence. That was reduced as time went by. It got reduced and reduced and reduced until eventually it was just merely a year and a half. The people who he was involved with were some of the central people. We see Dayan on the left, by the way. It's an unusual picture, the tall fellow. That's without the eye patch. So that's what many people, many young Israelis, when they see this, wouldn't know who he is. He's with Yitzhak Sadeh, who was one of the central founders of the Palmach, which is the other leftist militia, and Yigal Allon, who at a later stage became the commander of the Palmach at Kibbutz Chanita in 1938. The story. Dayan was arrested in 1939 by the British in a show trial, and I just mentioned it, 10 years imprisonment. But the most interesting thing about it is his stay in jail, a year and a half in jail. And how did he relate to it? He says, I regarded my stay behind bars as a passing episode, unpleasant for the inmates, difficult for their relatives, but certainly not to be spent huddled in a cocoon of misery. And I think this says just about everything about Moshe Dayan. He went through very tough situations in life. Army life, by definition, is tough. The Israeli army has always been very difficult because it's an ongoing experience. But the fact that he felt that being in jail for a year and a half was something that you shouldn't feel as a cocoon of misery says something very interesting about him. What we find here afterwards is that as time went on, Moshe Dayan got involved in the Nakba, which is the word catastrophe in Arabic, War of Independence. And here we see a picture of the trucks which used to go from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem at a time when Jerusalem was cut off completely, and the Arab militias were quite successful in attacking the trucks and disabling them. The 48 War, as it's called, the War of Independence, very, very complex war, very difficult war. Israel lost approximately 1% of its population, which is a high percentage. And when we look at the people who lost their lives, most of them were between the ages of 17 and 25. So the kind of people who really want to build the country, a considerable number of them lost their lives in the war. And this is a very difficult early stage. A wonderful book, by the way, if any of you like sort of light historical books, called O Jerusalem. It's a well-known book by two journalists, Collins and Lapierre, speak about where Dayan was really very active in the war itself. It was a war in Lida and Ramla, now called Lod and Ramla, cities between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And Dayan was very central. The writers say the following: vital to the Israelis' quick success were the spectacular tactics of a commander unit led by a one-eyed officer. By at that time, he had lost his eye in serving the British forces in Lebanon in 1941. He lost his eye serving the British, although the British had jailed him, whose face was destined to become the symbol of his country's military success. There was another event in the War of Independence. One thinks of the War of Independence as a war between the Jews and the Arabs, but it was much more than that. There was a major conflict, and I'm sure many of you know this, between the left-wing forces and the right-wing forces. On the left, you have the Haganah and the Palmach, very much identified with socialist Zionism. And on the right, you have the Irgun Tzva Leumi, and the Stern group, who were identified with the right wing and later on in history with Menachem Begin. The Altalena was bringing arms to the forces at a time when the Israel Defense Force, the Israeli army, was already established. This is a month after the establishment of Israel. And David Ben-Gurion at the time was very frightened that opposition militia would start taking military action into their own hands. And so he sent some of the young officers of Dayan was there, and Yitzhak Rabin was there, and some others. They went there and actually attacked the Altalena boat, which, as I said, was bringing arms to the opposition Jewish forces. and burnt the boat, and a number of people were killed. By the way, this incident remained important in Israeli history essentially until today. It was almost a sense of having a civil war. The unusual part about Dayan was who he could get on with and who he couldn't. Here we have the story of Moshe Dayan and Abdullah Tal. Abdullah Tal was a Jordanian officer, and what we know about the Jordanian officer, sorry, just one step back. What we know about the Jordanian officer was the following comment. He says, he writes of Abdullah Tal, in the negotiations that led up to the agreement, that was the agreement of January 1949 between the Jordanians and Israelis. It was not a peace agreement, by the way. It was kind of more of an intermediary agreement, which was to try and establish some boundaries. He says, I got to know my Arab counterpart rather well. Abdullah Tal was a tall young man, handsome, light-skinned, with a directness about him. He looked you straight in the eye and with an open and friendly smile. When I met him, he impressed me as being far superior to the other Arab officers and political functionaries I had encountered in that period. Incidentally, he hated the British officials who were the real rulers in Amman, the capital of Jordan. Just something about Moshe Dayan and the Arabs. It's very, very confusing. I've been through the literature. I've read a number of biographies. It's never quite clear exactly how he looked at the Arab world. What we do know, and this is we know from other situations in the world, military people have a common language with other military people. And it seemed to be that Moshe Dayan could get on quite well with Arab military leaders. And we know from various Arab sources that when Arab society relates to Israeli leaders, probably highest on the totem pole, so to speak, is Moshe Dayan. They say of him, he spoke directly, you knew exactly what he meant. There was no fishy political talk going on. And so there was this unusual relationship, which we sometimes find in history, where enemies really do have a common language. But Dayan was not only always involved in military activities, he was an archeologist, but only in his own mind. There is an ongoing story in Israel about Dayan's archeological activities. He was a thief. There's no other word for it. He would go wherever he wanted. He took soldiers with him, totally illegally, and they would go and look for archeological digs. By the way, we know that in many cases, he totally messed up the dig. He had no real idea. He really didn't know what he was doing. But this is really what he was all about. And here you can see some of his archeological possessions. By the way, when he died and people went to his house and they went into the back garden and looked at all the other possessions he had, it was an absolute scandal. But in those days, and maybe in these days, not all politicians seem to obey all the regulations that they're supposed to. In 1953, he became the chief of staff. And pretty much to understand Dayan's tremendous influence, and if you've read the handout which I sent to Ari, or if you read it after this, you'll get a very good sense that Dayan wanted to be a hero. He didn't just see himself as a military person or later as a politician. He had a tremendous ego, but he was capable. That means the ego came out of a reality, a good reality. And in the period between 1953 and 1958, he really moved the Israeli army from being fairly amateur, which it had been in 1948. In 1948, there weren't that many people who'd had real military experience. But as a result of Israel's War of Independence, a small cadre of skilled officers came about. And as soon as Dayan moved into the position of chief of staff in 1953, he looked to see who Israeli soldiers are. A little bit of history. In 1948, the population in Palestine, Eretz Israel, was 650,000. In late 1951, early 1952, about 3 years later, the population had doubled. So it's an amazing period of 3 years, doubling up total population in the country. And what happened is that therefore the army had to induct a significant number of people who were new immigrants. And when Dayan started looking at the army in 1953, he realized that this wasn't an army. These were a group of people from all around the world, many of them Holocaust survivors. At that time, many of them coming from countries like Yemen and Iraq. And therefore, it was very necessary to build the army. And he really did build the army. It was an amazingly important period. And what happened in the Sinai campaign was essentially a complex issue. Because when we look at the end of the Sinai campaign, as a result of the Eisenhower Doctrine of 1958, Israel had to withdraw to its earlier borders. So it was a war where there was no border gain. And therefore, historians afterwards said, why was it considered such a success? The success of the Sinai campaign was that there was quiet for almost 10 years, from 1958 or 57 until just before the Six-Day War of 1967. Israel was essentially in a quiet relationship with Egypt. This is relative. Some people would look and say that wasn't quiet, but relative to what happened in other periods, this was a quiet period. So one can say that the Sinai campaign was indeed a successful situation. Danny Gordon explains it, and once again, in terms of sources, this is a very readable book, and I'll just read the last sentence. He was determined to transform the Israel Defense Forces into the most fearsome military in the Middle East. That may well be true of that particular time. There were tough events going on, and one particular event was this particular situation of Roi Rotenberg, who in a border conflict was caught by the Arabs, and his body was horribly mutilated. The issue that I think is important here is the eulogy, and it says something about Dayan. Being a social historian, one isn't only looking for the facts of a phenomenon, one's trying to understand the human being behind the particular actions. And I think this says something quite important about Dayan. And it's an interesting perspective. Dayan always was out of the box. Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? For 8 years they sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and have seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once dwelt. If we just think of this for a moment, people in war and military people often don't really look at the other side. And it's difficult. I've spent some time in the army, and I've worked with army officers. And I know sometimes in terms of what you're supposed to do, there is a dehumanizing of the other side. And this is shown by studies around the world. But it's interesting when we look at Dayan here, and he actually understands the issue of jealousy, and he actually understands what sort of situation they were living in. And, I think it's very important in all kinds of conflict to really have a sense of who the other is. To dehumanize the other isn't good, just in terms of how you cope with the situation. And I think one of Dayan's successes was he did try to understand the other. One might not agree with how he looked at it, but there certainly was a sensitivity in terms of who the other is. So here we see Moshe Dayan in that successful Sinai campaign. And he, after his position of chief of staff, he became a minister of agriculture for a period of about 5 years. Interesting about Dayan, once again, this unusual person, very military, very much concerned with war, very aware of where Israel is in the Middle East in a difficult kind of area. And yet at the same time, we see through his writings a tremendous sense of land and production and creativity. So there's the soft side to a very military man at the same time. The Six-Day War. Dayan was pretty much out of the picture. Minister of Agriculture wasn't what he was really interested in. He then left politics. He went on to Nahalal, where he had spent a number of years. And in the period just before the Six-Day War, which is considered one of the most difficult political periods of Israeli history, you have the following. In late May 1967, it was pretty clear that a war was going to break out. The Prime Minister of the time, Levi Eshkol, who was a hesitant political leader, was very, very reluctant to go into the war alone, having remembered what had happened in 1948 when Israel was all by itself. He decided that it was important to obtain the support of the United States, France, and Britain, and therefore, slowly but surely, he went through negotiations. He sent the famous Abba Eban to negotiate with the various countries that I mentioned. And the response of most of the countries was, we will only support you if you don't carry out a preemptive strike. The generals of the time, and Moshe Dayan was not involved at that stage, were very, very angry. And it was even a fear in the country that the generals would take over from Levi Eshkol, not as a coup, but rather force him to do what he didn't want to do. The country was in turmoil. And I, at that time, was in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. I arrived in Israel one day before the Six-Day War. And I remember very, very clearly, not only how we had felt when we were overseas, but even on the day before the Six-Day War, the sense of tremendous being ill at ease. However, there was one thing that I remember people saying, Moshe Dayan is now in the government. He was brought in at the very last moment as the Minister of Defense. And because of his reputation as the hero of the Suez campaign of 1956, the country was lifted up. The Six-Day War was successful. Rapid victory over the surrounding countries. And this picture is really one of the famous ones where you see Moshe Dayan in the middle, Yitzhak Rabin on the right, and on the left, Uzi Narkis, who was head of the Central Command. Just one point. The truth is, and this we only learn a lot later, that it was because of Yitzhak Rabin that the war was successful. He was the chief of staff. He had developed the Israeli army to be even more modern and better equipped than anyone could have imagined from the 50s. But Dayan was considered, once again, he was the hero of Sinai. Here he was the hero of the Six-Day War, and that gave him tremendous status. What do we see about his relationship with the population? As a result of the Six-Day War, Israel was in control of a very significant number of Arabs. In the northern part of the country, in the Golan Heights, we have the Golan Druze. In the West Bank, we have the Palestinians, in Judea and Samaria, the Palestinians. And in the south, we have very large Palestinian population in Gaza. Moshe Dayan here requires some critical questioning. What did he really want? And until today, there's been discussion in Israel on how did he look at the Israeli position over the Palestinians. There is no moment that we can find where he ever supported a Palestinian state. At the same time, he didn't want Israel to rule over the Palestinians. So what does that mean? And it seems that every now and again we would hear and read his comments, which would kind of help us to understand. When he spoke to the Muhtars are the village leaders, he said to them, and this we know that these were the words, we do not ask you to love us, we only ask that you care for your own people and work with us in restoring the normalcy of their lives. Now, what does this mean? It's very hard to make sure that what does this really mean. As I said, he never wanted a Palestinian state. And it seems that what we have to understand about his relationship with the Palestinians, which is a major issue just after the Six-Day War, as it is today, this issue has never left the centrality of the Israeli reality. He wanted something which he sometimes called formal annexation, but it wasn't annexation as we understand it. It was something much lighter. At a later stage, and we only know this many, many years later, he speaks about unilateral autonomy. Now, what does unilateral autonomy mean? It means something like a proto-state, something like an area of the world where the people do not have statehood per se, but at the same time are running their own lives. And this is very much tied up with his open bridges idea. Palestinians would be able to cross over to Jordan and back into Israel. Palestinians would be able to move around the whole of Israel without any restrictions. But it is not clear exactly what his particular idea of autonomy was all about. And so we read these comments without quite knowing what the result was. Some years later, and this was, by the way, after he had traveled to Vietnam and he had looked very closely at what happened in the Vietnam War, we have the Yom Kippur War. At that time, he is the president, he is the foreign defense minister, I'm sorry, he is the defense minister under Golda Meir. The war had some very, very negative components. And the worst section was his panic. And I'll just read to you what happened at that particular time. He panicked, and he even at a certain time was about to make a television interview. And he told Golda Meir what he wanted to say in the interview, and he was going to say he wanted to discuss the possible destruction of the third temple. Wow. Israel has been around. It is going to be destroyed. It'll be not like the first temple and not like the second temple, but maybe even worse. And this would be the destruction of the third temple. By the way, Golda refused to give him permission to speak on television. Afterwards, there was a commission of inquiry, as there always is in Israel. And as a result of the commission of inquiry, Dayan decided to resign. By the way, he had no alternative. The pressure in the country against Dayan and Golda Meir was so great that he had to resign. This seemed to be the end of him. It seemed very, very much that Moshe Dayan was just out of the picture. He was very angry at the way that both the Israeli public and the politicians of the party had behaved towards him. In 1974, in the election just after the Yom Kippur War, Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister. And just as a sign to show how Dayan was looked at, they didn't even give him a ministerial position, which one might have expected for someone who'd had the career that he had, that he would be given some job in this situation. So this is Dayan at the all-time lowest. very depressed kind of situation. And what he does basically, he goes off and writes 2 books. He writes the second book, The Story of My Life, and then he writes the book, Living with the Bible. So he's got a bit of quiet time. But then, as we know so often in history, that even with his writing, it wasn't going to be enough with him. But he loved that free time. The time that he was away from politics and away from the army was a very creative time with him. So depressed in terms of how the country had responded to him, he was elevated with the book, Living with the Bible, as I said earlier, an absolute delightful book. Just to read it, because I think this is Dayan. Once again, what he wrote about himself when he isn't trying to be the military person is very interesting. I was introduced to the stories of the Bible as a boy, like all Jewish children born in the land of the book. My teacher at Nahalal not only taught us about the early days of our people, he also invested them with a sense of present reality. It was as though events that had occurred 3,000 and 4,000 years ago were happening now. And I think this is a really lovely little section, which in a certain way explains what Dayan is about. He is not only living a contemporary life, he is living a different kind of life. 1977, there are new elections, and in the elections, there's a major change in Israeli political realities with the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, which extended from 1978 over to the actual signing in Washington in 1979. A little bit of the background, which we know from Dayan's book called Breakthrough, but it's also been ratified by many other sources. Menachem Begin brought in, and if you just look at what's happening, he brought in a failed general. I mean, why would he do this? Now, Menachem Begin had almost no governmental experience. He'd been in government just for a very short period after the Six-Day War, but he really hadn't been around much. He wasn't well known, and he had been remembered by some countries in the world as being a terrorist. He was called a terrorist by the British. So he needed someone in the government who would have international status. And this is what Dayan had. In the handout that I gave you, you can see that American society was very, very impressed with him. And Menachem Begin believed that by bringing in Dayan as Minister of Defense, that would be a very important and useful position. He and Ezra Weizmann, who was also a well-known character in Israeli history, had a tremendous impact on Menachem Begin. And it's really these two people, Dayan and Weizmann, who pushed Begin, perceived at that time in history as a hardline right-winger, to sign the treaty with Anwar Sadat, which was the first treaty that Israel had ever signed with an Arab country. By the way, we sometimes forget what the world was like then. For the Egyptians to sign a treaty with us was remarkable. And unfortunately, the Arab world totally excommunicated, so to speak, Egypt, rejected Egypt, and then obviously Sadat paid the highest price when he was assassinated. But a peace treaty was signed, and whatever we can say about the Israeli-Egyptian relationship today, it might be a cold peace, but it's better than the alternative. Moshe Dayan resigned from the Begin government because they wouldn't agree to the clause in the peace treaty which spoke about unilateral autonomy for the Palestinians. So the last political idea that we know is that he did want the Palestinians to have autonomy. He did want the state of Israel to have a larger control. He was against the Israel giving up the Jordan Valley. In fact, at a certain time, he was even against in terms of Israel giving up Sinai and the Gaza Strip. So he was in many senses a maximalist, a socialist Zionist maximalist, who, when push came to shove, was frightened of a Palestinian state, but was also petrified by Israel having to control on a day-to-day level over 3 or 4 million Palestinians. To conclude my presentation, I'm looking forward to any questions you have. The comment on the New York Times, the heading in the New York Times, and look, it's a nice big section of the New York Times. I mean, this is little Israel. So he got a big picture there and a very good article by David Chipler. Moshe Dayan, 66, dies in Israel, hero of war, architect of peace. And to conclude, this is what I think Moshe Dayan would have wanted the world to imagine. Firstly, they wanted him to remember him as the chief of staff. That was his great moment, although obviously the 6-Day War was also important. But the comment here is quite unusual. So they don't say Moshe Dayan, politician and peacemaker. Moshe Dayan, this is almost autobiographical. If people had written this and he had known it, he would have been delighted. He taught us everything we know. My final comment about Moshe Dayan: he was a military man, politician, pragmatic, and in some ways also a teacher. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Liptz. That was terrific. I have asked people if they have questions to post them, so I'm waiting for people to post questions. I did get an email question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
So let me see. I have an email, even though I asked people to post. Someone emailed me a question, so let's see if I can find it. Here. What is your view on the impact, short-term and long-term, of Dayan's decision in '67 to give Jordan control over the Temple Mount versus exerting Israeli control?
Sorry, I didn't hear it. Could you just say it again? Sorry, I didn't hear it clearly.
Yeah. What is your view on the impact, short-term and long-term, of Moshe Dayan's decision in 1967 to give Jordan control over the Temple Mount, as opposed to, I guess, having it retained by Israel?
You see, this is part of his overall policy. He's hard to define. And I think what we find here is that he had always hoped that there would be good relations with Jordan. The Temple Mount then, and until today in a much more limited way, was under Jordanian control. And I think what he was really hoping for, I don't know if he really imagined there would be a peace treaty with Jordan, as did happen in 1994. But I think while he was ambivalent about the Palestinians, he was much clearer in terms of what he wanted with Arab countries. Therefore, as we know, he signed the agreement with Egypt, and I think he didn't want to do anything which would have annoyed the Jordanians. So I think that's where he came from. You know, to take over the Temple Mount is a big issue. And I think anyone who understands Middle Eastern politics knows that even though we might have fairly good relations with a small number of Arab countries, to actually take over Temple Mount, we have a certain presence there, but to actually take over Temple Mount, I think would have got Israel into a very difficult issue. So my own view is that one has to have an element of realpolitik. You have to do what is feasible and to ask the questions of what the long-term implications are. And I think in terms of Arab countries, many of our Israeli politicians have managed to do that.
Thank you. Francine Morrison asked, did he have any formal military education?
Sorry, if we...
Did Moshe Dayan
formal military education?
Yeah.
Yeah, he spent a bit of time in England. He went to do a course in England. That was really his formal education. He writes some very funny things about being in England. He says he was given one of those aids that the British officers have, someone to clean his boots and things like that. And he just didn't understand what was going on half the time. So his formal military education was actually by the time he spent at the Officers Training College in England. And by the way, he was a tremendous reader. So a lot of his learning came from that. And I imagine that the time he spent in Vietnam was extremely important. We know that he had such status that when he went to Vietnam, he had access to just about all the military leaders who were present in Vietnam, in addition to which he had spent some time in America speaking to the military people. I think he learns not so much through formal classes, but through experience. And by the way, just in terms of the Vietnam War, quite a long time before the Vietnam War ended, he already said that there's no doubt about it that America can't win. He looked at what was going on, he saw how complex it was, and I think maybe before many American decision makers, he had the feeling. So he picks up things sometimes in formal learning, reading, and also very much by being on the ground. He was one of those leaders, one of the chiefs of staff. He was out in the field. He wasn't learning from behind a desk. He was learning being out there with everyone else. So I think that's what his military experience came from. But you know, he wasn't always so good. Okay in 56, okay in 67, come 73, he panicked. So that's the reality.
Did he expect to be prime minister? Would he have been prime minister if not for 73?
Some of the experts think that he really never wanted to be a number one politician. He liked being number one in the army. I don't think he wanted to be the prime minister. I think it wasn't his style. People who worked closely with him, and I've met a few of them, said he was an intolerant person. By the way, he had quite a lot of problem with his eye. There'd been an earlier attempt at a bone transplant and things, and this had been very problematic part of him. He was tense. He was often very tense. I know once he went on a lecture tour to England, and it was very formal, and he was supposed to sit around and wait for all the presentations, and he got fed up and he just walked up in the middle and went off. So this isn't the kind of person who can run a government. He can be in charge of a ministry. So we have no indication that he really would have gone for the prime minister position.
Someone asked, what did he die of? He died pretty young.
He died of cancer in just about a year before he actually died. He was 69 years old when he died. He got cancer, and it was a short period of time, not a lengthy period of time, which, for example, Golda Meir had. So that's what it did to him. Young, 69, young.
Jake Jacobs asked, are you currently advising the Israeli army again in any capacity, anything with respect to the pandemic?
No. So what I did, I'm out of the army because you can't stay in the reserves above a certain age. I was actually in a little longer than normal. What I was doing at that stage was very interesting. The army would bring me in non-military realms, and the Israeli army has a whole unit within the education unit, which deals with the social and human problems within that organization. So I had a wonderful, wonderful army career. People used to be surprised when I was called up for the reserves that I was always so happy. For me, it was the best way of learning about Israeli society. So I was always happy. By the way, most of the time it was for short service. They would bring me in for a day or 2 days or 3 days in very, very different situations, but no longer. There are other good people to do the good work now. It was a wonderful army career. I'd been in a field position. I'd been in the first Lebanon, in the first Lebanon War, 1982, and that was another business. So when I managed to get out of being in a field unit, I was quite happy to be an education person.
Okay. Louis Grossman asked that he heard that Dayan had become very wealthy. In the chat that he sent me, he said he wrote checks to pay his bills and those checks never got cashed. Is that true or fiction?
Look, I'm going to make a non-politically correct comment. He is not the first Israeli politician who's lived that way. He was not a poor man by any means, by the way. Nahal was a very, very successful moshav. So he is really, and he came from this elite kind of family. Shmuel Dayan was very much respected. It is said that he made some money out of illegal archaeological sales. I would believe it, by the way. There's nothing about Dayan which makes me wouldn't believe that. He made money out of his books as well, and he made money out of lectures. So, he was one of the Israeli leaders of that earlier generation, most of whom weren't wealthy. He apparently did have a fair amount. By the way, Israel's not very good at disclosure, generally speaking. So I think what in other countries one might be demanded to show. I know some presidents in America have not shown their income tax reality. But in Israel, across the board, by the way, it's very, very difficult to know for these kind of people exactly the amount of money they had. But he was a very obviously comfortably off, that we do know.
In the last few minutes we have, Rabbi Charlie Savinour had a question about if you could share the story about Dayan sending his daughter down to see Marat HaMachpelah. If you know that story. Martin Hart asked a related question: what are Dayan's children doing these days? So we can end with those two questions.
What do they do
doing these days?
So there are two questions. There is some story apparently about Dayan sending his daughter down to see Marat HaMachpelah. I don't know what that story is.
He mentions that. That's right. Yeah.
And the second is, what are his kids doing these days?
Okay. So look, Dayan had no restrictions. So whenever he wanted to do anything, he would. So it's true. Yael Dayan, I think she writes about it in one of her books. She was sent down there, and he wanted her. I'm sorry, we've got a cat who's jumping on the table. He wanted her to look at what was going on there. So they were close. Yael apparently was sent quite often to just learn about things. I'm not sure if it had any other particular issue, but the kids, they all three wrote. Yael, by the way, so Assi, I don't know what Udi did. I don't think he had a particularly important issue. Assi was a filmmaker, very well known, by the way, terrific. He was a terrific filmmaker until he went on to drugs. Yael was a politician. She was a very interesting politician, by the way, somewhat like her mother, Ruth, pretty much on the Israeli left. She was involved in peace now kind of activities. She was very concerned with a whole range of human issues, which is exactly was the story of Ruth. So mother and daughter were very similar in terms of their activities and interests. Yael is well known. I've met Yael a few times. She was a rough one, just like the father. We were sitting in the Knesset, and I was with a group of visitors from overseas, and she was smoking. And there was someone in the group who had trouble, just had an illness, and was finding it a great deal of problem. So I whispered in Yael's ear very quietly, trying to be politically correct, please don't smoke, someone's having a problem with your smoking. So I said it quietly, and then she shouts out very loudly, oh, those Americans, they're always complaining about something. So the Dayans were not all that politically correct, to put it mildly. So that's what happened. The three children, all of whom, by the way, I mentioned at the beginning, had trouble with the father. So